certainly an element of luck involved in these things, but you can't count on luck, and you can't count on timing, and therefore you've got to prepare as best you can for an exit process. And in our view, and our learning has been that you start with the exit process when you buy a business. I think lots of people will say to you that in assessment of a business, you always look at who would be the potential buyers for that company when you want to sell it. But I think it goes beyond that. I think when we buy those companies, we also make sure that we position our rights in terms of shareholders agreements with management teams and with consortium partners in such a way that we can give effect to an exit. So we've got to be able to realize a company at the back end, and we've got to make sure that there's complete alignment between all the consortium partners. Therefore, the shareholders agreement rights are incredibly important. I think the next important thing, and why we say it starts at the beginning, is consortium partners as well as management teams always need to understand that private equity invests and there's a realization phase. And they've got to be ready for it, and they've got to be aligned for it, and they've got to have a strategy to deal with it over the 5-year period. And that takes lots of work from day one. I think it depends on the asset and the quality of the asset. I think that I've seen all the routes, starting from trade sale, financial buyers selling in a secondary, IPO, or selling back to management team. And all of those differ. I think clearly what you want to do is you want to make sure when you buy an asset that you can position yourself for disposal of the asset to the widest range of potential buyers. That is first prize. So run a competitive process, have an IPO backup as a possible route to listing, and that is the clear preference. But all assets don't work that way. Certain assets you've got to go and dispose in processes where you have to engage exclusively with one party because it makes sense for that asset to sell it in that way. Certain assets you have to go and dispose back to the management team because they're the logical buyers of an asset, and you won't be able to have an effective auction process. And I think flexibility and really the art of determining which one would work for you, for your stakeholders and for the company, I think that is not straightforward, and you've got to work on it, and it takes quite a bit of time to get that right. But I think all of it is open in this market. I think the market is buoyant. I think there are lots of financial buyers. I think the IPO market is very attractive at this point in time. And I think trade buyers have got lots of cash, so they're interested in assets. And that's nice about trying to sell into the South African market. It makes a lot of sense to look at the asset and then pick the right exit route for the asset. The more sport transaction, the retail market at that point in time was really going well. More sport, the retail pricing on the stock exchange, the PEs were at a high, and it was an attractive asset for the retail market. And at that stage, we didn't have sufficient trade interest to really say that alternative was better than IPOing the business. It made logical sense for us to take that one to the IPO market. And for us, that's been an incredibly successful IPO, and we're very, very pleased with it. In other instances, we sold the business. In Tebo, for instance, it's a food services company that we sold a couple of years ago. There was a lot of interest in that asset because it was a strategic asset. It's strategically positioned in the South African market, and we knew that we would have a lot of interest from both local and international trade buyers as well as local financial buyers in that asset. And therefore, a well-controlled, formal auction process made most sense to optimize value in that instance. When we look at the disposal of Dunlop tyres, which we sold to Apollo Tyres in India, that was one where we got an approach from the Indian trade buyer. They were really interested in the asset. There was a lot of synergies that could be driven out of it, and they also wanted to expand through Dunlop into Africa. And therefore, there was no point in us actually running a wide auction process on that one. We looked at it, we looked at the offer on the table, and we looked at their seriousness of buying this asset from us, and we said, let's engage with them on an exclusive basis because it made a lot of sense to do that. I think then we also had a business called Magic Company, which we owned in the 90s. Magic Company was a business that went through its ups and downs, but at a certain point in time, our relationship was such with management that we said, management, you are the logical buyer of this business. And in that process, we designed a structured exit process through refinancings, and we got our liquidity through effectively re-gearing the business a couple of times over and then selling the business back to management. So all of them are different examples, and all of them make sense for different reasons. There's no one size fits all. As a controlling shareholder, which is what we prefer in most transactions, we want to make sure that we can drive the exit for the benefit of all stakeholders in the business and deliver a premium price for the assets. And therefore, as a control house, we want to also make sure that we can select the best route at that point in time and get the rest of the stakeholders over the line. Now, there is a conflict of interest at that point, because management may say, well, we actually don't want to go to trade, we want to go to IPO, or we don't want to go to trade, we want to go to financial sponsor, and you've got to manage that very carefully. Definitely not opportunistic from our side. I mean, there are instances where we get approaches for assets. We then have to, it may be premature for us to consider it, but we will give it its full attention and then say, well, you know, does it make sense to accelerate our investment horizon that we've got for an asset? But in most instances, it's actually well planned and thought through process. And as I said, you know, we start at the investment phase planning for it by looking at the exit routes and then looking at how we structure the shareholders agreements. But then every single quarter, we sit down as an organization and we think through what is the right timing for an asset. And you know, people sometimes think that preparing the information memorandum is the start of an exit process. In our view, preparing for an information memorandum is the last step in the process. By that time, our business needs to be ready. It needs to have positioned itself for and have strategies for the future that would make it an attractive asset. And we also needed to have scanned the market for the right type of buyers for this business at that point in time. So we get opportunistic, but I would say mostly it's actually a well-controlled planned process that we start 2-3 years in advance of the ultimate exit. You can never underestimate the amount of planning that you need to put into an exit. You know, in the same way that doing an acquisition is really a deal-making process, an exit's also a deal-making process. And as you said now, there's no one-size-fits-all, and there's always give and take in the process. And you've also got to be realistic and fair to the counterparty that you're dealing with, because in our market, it is extremely small, and you only sell one asset, you only sell an asset to a counterparty once, and you give them a tough time in the negotiations. Next time round, it won't work that way, and you may be on the other end of those negotiations. So I would say be fair and ensure that you prepare extremely well.